start by saying that I am sick. I think I've got a bit of a cold going. I definitely have congestion brain, but hopefully my voice isn't too off. I have a feeling, I have a feeling that it'll turn into a whisper at some point, because I've tried starting this video, I think 5 or 6 times now, and every time it would just come out in a whisper. But you and I, we will get through this video together, because I couldn't wait any longer to get into your guys' hot takes. I've mentioned this before, but I was so surprised at the response from you on my community post asking for your MMA and UFC hot takes, unpopular opinions, and I want to give all of these the proper time and discussion. So this is going to turn into a bit of a series on the channel for as long as you enjoy this content. So if your comment from that post isn't included in this video, it will definitely come up soon. And if you're watching this video and you did not get a chance to share your hot take, definitely leave a comment under this video. Give me a couple flame emojis or tell me my unpopular opinion is, because these are so much fun to read and discuss. And as always, if your comment is, I think I used the term well-intentioned last time, we will talk about it here. I also have to mention that the comments under that community post did spark some discussions, and a lot of it was so much fun and respectful. So I want to thank you all for being so active and kind in our community. You know, it truly warms my heart, and that's what I want to build here. And speaking of continuing to build our community, I will link a new Discord server for the channel in the description. I imagine if you're looking at it when this video comes out, it will be pretty bare, but yeah, I just love seeing the discussions happening in the comments of all of our videos, so hopefully we can keep some of that going in the Discord as well. And I welcome any tips on building out that Discord, because I am pretty new to the platform. But enough housekeeping. For this video, I pulled each one of your hot takes that either included a comment about someone being overrated, or conversely, comments about a fighter being the GOAT, and we're gonna fight about it. I don't know if I should cut that out or not. You'll know by now. But let's start with Ronda Rousey. She's the only woman on the list for this video, so thank you, Chunk, for bringing a women's MMA fighter into this. You said Ronda Rousey is the best women's UFC fighter ever. Let me say this first. I think I've talked about this on the channel before, but while Rousey was active in the UFC, UFC, I was not a fan. Plain and simple. I thought she was immensely overrated. I thought the UFC did her a lot of favors. And to be honest, I was a bit annoyed because I felt she was taking, through no fault of her own really, other than the fact that I never heard her talk about it, but I felt like she was taking the credit away from the real pioneers of women's MMA. You know, the mainstream, especially the people who have sort of like UFC blinders on and don't consider other promotions, they were crediting her with sort of making women's MMA a thing. And as someone who started watching MMA through the women's side, you know, on Elite XC and Strikeforce, and I'm really aging myself now, while Dana was saying that women would never fight in the UFC, yeah, I just didn't like the fact that she was getting that credit when I felt like other women deserved some of the love as well. And again, I've said this, but nowadays I do have a lot more appreciation for her and what she did for the women's game, and just generally as an athlete, you know, I mean, she's an Olympic medalist. There's no denying that she is a great martial artist. That being said, at this point, I don't think that she's the best women's fighter that the UFC has seen, especially if we're talking pound for pound. I mean, even just at bantamweight, I think it was before the Rocky Pennington fight at 297 that I mentioned bantamweight sort of being a dead weight class right now, and that I was really hoping that these women would give it a little life. But do I think Rousey would ever have beat Amanda Nunes? 9 times out of 10, no. The 50 or so seconds we did see was horrifying. And then pound for pound, you have to look at Valentina, Grasso, Joanna Whaley. Those are tough opponents for Rousey. She wasn't a striker. She wasn't a well-rounded fighter. And I think she would have benefited from someone who wasn't Edmund Tarverdyan. She would have benefited from someone who wasn't Edmund. I do think she would have beat Rose, to be fair. I would have loved to see her as like a tall flyweight. And a lot of this comes down to the evolution of MMA. A lot of these fighters that we'll be discussing today, I mean, this is why there are hot takes about these people, because the sport has been studied and is being developed, and training is being maximized since 10, 20 years ago. Now, credit where credit is due. If we're talking about just the time spent in the octagon, no, I don't think Rousey is the best. If we're talking about success as a UFC fighter, more globally, money, recognition, I'd say she did what Conor McGregor did on the men's side, which really hasn't been replicated by either men or women since them, So from that perspective, and with a little help from the UFC, I think there's no denying that she's the most successful. And that sort of makes me want to hear from you guys. In the comments, let me know, and I'll have like a pinned comment so we can discuss this. Would you rather be a great fighter or a great showman in the UFC? I know my answer, but I want to hear from you guys first. And then maybe I'll share my thoughts on that in the next UFC hot takes video. My answer might surprise you. I don't know. But see, Chong, you just made me ramble on and on about a topic that I love, which is, first of all, women's MMA and sort of the Zuffa era UFC. So I can't thank you enough for your comment. And speaking of the Zuffa era, we'll have more on that in another UFC hot takes video. I can promise you that. A lot of you guys had opinions about the current state of affairs at the UFC, and I agree with a lot of it, so I can't wait to get to that soon. But today we're sticking to GOATs and overrated fighters, and I realize now we'll have to get through them a little bit quicker. So let's move on to, I think, the only active fighter I have on the list today. Well, no, that's not true, because Jon Jones is active and Conor McGregor is debatable. But let's talk about Khamzat, is what I'm trying to say. So Brandon said Khamzat is overrated and will be exposed if/when he fights a legit middleweight. Yeah, I mean, my thing about Khamzat is that he fought in chronological order in the UFC: middleweight, welterweight, middleweight, welter, catchweight, and then middleweight, most recently against Kamaru. So since 2020, or I'll say since January of 2021, he's only fought once at middleweight, if I'm not mistaken. And again, that was against Kamaru, who moved up because he couldn't get the belt off of Leon, with all due respect. So we'll get into the weight class jumping and the oversaturation of roster in the next video, because I know you guys have strong opinions, and I do too. But how is Khamzat, as fun as he is to watch, how is he ranked 11 at middleweight? His rise to fame in the UFC was a combination of skills and luck, in that obviously he deserves a UFC contract. He has made that much clear. But when the pandemic hit, he was fighting for Brave, which is a promotion out of Bahrain. Then the UFC moved to Abu Dhabi, and they needed fighters who could be there. So they signed Khamzat, and like I said, it wasn't all luck. He made a splash with that second round submission, and then he came back 10 days later, cut down to welterweight, and got a first round KO. would he have been back 10 days later if it wasn't for the pandemic? Not a chance. And that's what I mean by luck. The pandemic definitely worked in his favor here. So I think Khamzat, it's coming out extra phlegmy since I'm sick. I think Khamzat is very talented. He deserves to be in the UFC. But, and I say this often, and again, this isn't part due to the size of the roster, which we'll get into next video, but I wish he would fight more and against better opponents. Same thing I said about Merab, same thing I say about a bunch of fighters, because I don't really think that right now we know truly what he's like at middleweight and if he is a contender. And by the way, last month he said that he plans to be back fighting in the summer, and he says he wants to fight in Saudi Arabia, and he says that they wanted him to fight at UFC 300, but that it was too short notice for 77 kilos, which is 170 pounds. Guys, 170 is welterweight, and I'm not blaming him. He's being a yes man in the UFC, which is what you need to do to keep working for them. But we'll never know how to properly rate Khamzat if he only fights in a weight class every 2 years. Does that make, do you know what I'm saying? Like, he'll fight at middleweight once every 2 years. He'll fight at middleweight once every 2 years. How can that make him a contender, or how can we know his true, I don't want to say value, but like, how do we know how to rate him if we barely see him fight? Anyway, I'll end my rant there and we'll pick it back up in the next hot takes video. Alright, you guys are making me even chattier than I expected, so I'll touch on the other 5 a bit quicker and you guys can sound off in the comments. So let's go with Jon Jones. So Neil said Jon Jones' resume is overrated and he's not close to being the GOAT in MMA. And then similarly, T said Jon Jones is not the GOAT. His actions outside the octagon and his steroid use really taint his legacy, and he will never be the greatest fighter of all time, in my opinion. The GOAT title belongs to GSP, and we'll get back to GSP in a bit. But Underdog replied, "You've got it backward. GSP is overrated and boring to watch. Jones's roid use does a bit, but like Nate said, everyone's on steroids. And for me, his antics outside the octagon, minus the incident involving the pregnant woman, only makes me like him more. He's a madman, and the fact that he was whooping ass even though he was partying just shows you how good he is. Imagine if he was 100% focused and healthy." Then T replied, "That's what I'm saying. Or that's what I'm saying, man. Imagine if he was healthy and a good dude outside the octagon. Not discarding the man's skill at all, but I don't know, it just feels like wasted potential. I really want to like Jon Jones, but I just can't because of that." And finally, Underdog replied, I hear I think we're all flawed to varying degrees. I'm actually drawn to the broken souls. I like characters with an edge and a bit of madness to them. But I definitely see what you're saying. So again, first of all, major shout outs to you guys for having a positive disagreement in the comments. I mean that genuinely. Like, I think that's often missing, especially in MMA and the MMA community. And I would really like it if this space becomes that. And it's something that we can discuss a little more in another hot takes video. But Jon Jones, interesting of you guys to bring up potential in these hot takes. Because that's really something that it's not really something that I've considered much before. But I think it would be hard to argue that Jon Jones wasn't the fighter with the most potential of all time in the UFC. It's really interesting to think about. Is he the GOAT? Y'all know he's not my GOAT. I can see the argument for him being GOAT. Like, I'll never call anyone crazy who thinks that Jon Jones is the greatest of all time. But going back to what I was saying earlier for Ronda Rousey, if the 15 to 25 minutes of fighting is just one piece of being a great UFC fighter, I think that what went on outside the octagon definitely takes him out of contention for me. And as a straight up fighter, I mean, okay, if we are to assume that all, or at least most, UFC fighters are on gear and are getting away with it, imagine how much stuff Jon Jones was on to get caught. Was it 2 or 3 times officially? To me, that's why I can't personally put him on my Mount Rushmore of fighters. Okay, GSP. Owen said GSP is the most overrated fighter ever. You guys already know GSP is my GOAT, and of course I'm biased. He's a fellow French Canadian, but let me make the case for GSP. 9 title defenses. He had average striking, but his striking defense was amazing. I mean, over his career, he averaged 1.4 absorbed strikes per minute, which is shockingly low, especially at a time where we saw a lot more just straight up brawlers in the UFC. He had 72% striking defense, averaged over 4 takedowns per fight. His takedown accuracy over his career was 74%. So if he wanted to take you down, he would. And 83% takedown defense. So if you wanted to take him down, you'd have a hard time of it. Just an incredibly well-rounded fighter, especially for the time. I think over his 26 wins, he had 8 knockouts, 6 submissions, and 12 decisions. And this is all at a time when, again, we'll touch more on oversaturation in another video, but this is at a time when he was fighting 3 4 times a year. He did not get a year off between fights. So I think it's hard to argue that he's not at least the greatest welterweight of all time. And I don't think most people think he's actually the GOAT. I think he's usually like somewhere between number 2 and number 4 in people's rankings. So I think all this to say, I think he's fairly rated, but you guys, let me know what you think in the comments. Next, let's talk about Mighty Mouse. So Saekyeon said Demetrious Johnson is the greatest MMA fighter we've ever seen, and leaving the UFC to fight in one only made him greater than if he had kept winning in UFC. And Crispy said, if Mighty Mouse never got traded, he would have got the Cejudo fight back and defended until he got too old, possibly even getting to 15 title defenses, his biggest adversary being Figgy, of course, but I genuinely believe DJ would have become the undisputed, no questions asked GOAT of all MMA. Yeah, first of all, Mighty Mouse for Ben Askren is a tragic trade. But you understand the reasons for DJ wanting out. He felt like the UFC did not market him enough. Which I agree with. I mean, probably the greatest flyweight of all time, and the people who are watching between 2011 and 2017, we know that. But the name and his image did not carry much weight outside of the core fan base of the UFC, and it still doesn't today. And I understand from the UFC's perspective that the flyweight division typically draws lower viewership numbers compared to other weight classes, but I'm of the opinion that if the UFC wants to offer that division, they need to make it exciting. It's their responsibility to draw in viewers, and you do that by making your champion one of the best fighters the UFC has ever seen. You make it known to your audience. And there's a similar issue with some of the women's divisions over time as well. But back to DJ moving. Of course, Matt Hume, his head coach, was, I think, a VP at one, so surely that had something to do with it. Did moving to one solve? I think I have an Amazon delivery, so I'll repeat that. Did moving to one solve Mighty Mouse's issue of not having proper exposure? Not in my opinion. For better or worse, the UFC really has a hold on MMA fans. But all that aside, is DJ the GOAT? Like I said with Jon Jones, I can see it. There's definitely an argument for it. He was a grappler, but he was a very well-rounded grappler. 11 title defenses. So I think you do have to consider him in a conversation about the GOAT. Now, Conor McGregor. A few of you had opinions about Conor. Omar said McGregor's resume is not as impressive as people think it is. Because of the publicity he got, it made his resume look crazy when he never even defended one of his belts. Gaethje said McGregor is the most overrated UFC fighter because he was pushed so hard by the UFC. His resume isn't as impressive as some under-the-radar guys that don't get the same respect. And then in defense of Conor, Moen said Conor McGregor is the best featherweight ever. I'll make this short because I want you guys to let me know what you think in the comments. I don't really know if I feel that he's overrated, because I haven't heard a lot of people say what Moen said, and to be fair, Moen might have been trolling. Like, he doesn't really come up all that often in GOAT conversations. I think what he did for the UFC is incomparable in terms of excitement and exposure. We have to give him credit for that, no doubt. His resume, it's interesting because look at his earlier fights. Decision win against Max, a TKO against Dustin, and a knockout against Jose Aldo, one of the guys who's considered a GOAT, probably the greatest featherweight. So 2013 to 2015, he was building an impressive resume, and then things took a turn. And I don't think many people are forgetting that he lost twice to Dustin, once to Khabib, and once to Nate Diaz. So maybe I'm just not in the circles where McGregor's resume is a talking point. But yeah, my feeling is that people take McGregor for what he was, or is, I guess. I mean, he keeps saying he's coming back. And finally, we have Khabib. Jon said Khabib is the #1 pound-for-pound fighter of all time. Pound for pound, he beats every fighter more than 5 out of 10 times. And Nobile said, no hate, but Khabib is not in the top 5 greatest fighter of all time list. This one's juicy. And to be honest, I kind of want to side with Nobile on this one. And same as you, it's no hate at all. I think he's a fantastic fighter. But nothing has ever made me think, oh, he's the greatest we've ever seen. I don't think you can place him above even some of the guys that we've talked about today. Jon Jones, Demetrious Johnson, GSP, even names like Fedor and Anderson Silva often come up before Khabib. Again, we talked about potential earlier with Jon Jones, and I would have loved to see Khabib fight longer. Obviously, he had a unique reason for retiring, and you have to respect that. But I know a lot of you guys see Khabib as, if not the GOAT, then definitely a top 5 fighter. So please, in the comments, let me know, respectfully, but let me know why Khabib should be placed on the Mount Rushmore of MMA fighters. And with that, guys, that was your hot takes on the best and most overrated UFC fighters. Thank you so much for sharing your opinions. It is genuinely a brave thing to do, especially in the MMA community. now I'm gonna stop talking. I'm gonna go have some soup and a nice nap. And I'll see you soon for the next video.